For roughly 40 years, the computing world operated on a single unspoken assumption. That assumption was this: Intel and AMD's x86 architecture was permanent. It was not merely dominant, it was for all practical purposes eternal. And the reason had very little to do with raw performance. x86's real power was something far harder to dislodge: continuity. Every operating system, every enterprise software suite, every line of code written by every developer over 4 decades. All. Think about what that means in practical terms. A hospital running patient management software, written in 2003, cannot simply swap out its processors on a whim. A bank relying on legacy financial systems built for x86 cannot restart from zero without catastrophic risk. The switching cost was so enormous that x86 essentially made itself irreplaceable. Not because it was always the best option, but because leaving it behind was more expensive than tolerating its flaws. That is how empires sustain themselves. Not always through excellence. Often through inertia. While x86 consolidated its empire, another philosophy was taking shape in a very different direction. ARM, which stands for Advanced RISC Machine, was born out of a British computing company called Acorn Computers in the mid-1980s. Its founding idea was almost the opposite of everything x86 represented. Where x86 grew increasingly complex, adding more instructions, more power, more heat, ARM pursued simplicity. Fewer instructions, lower power consumption, smaller chip designs. The name RISC itself, Reduced Instruction Set Computing, tells you everything. It was not about doing more. It was about doing what was necessary and doing it efficiently. For years, this philosophy was dismissed. Desktop users wanted power, server operators wanted throughput. ARM chips, beautiful as they were in their elegance, were seen as too modest for serious computing. They ended up in mobile phones, in calculators, in embedded systems, in devices where battery life mattered more than raw speed. Industry insiders called it the mobile architecture. They did not mean it as a compliment. That dismissal, comfortable and confident as it felt at the time, would eventually cost the old guard dearly. Then the smartphone arrived, and the world changed faster than anyone had prepared for. When Apple released the first iPhone in 2007, and when Android devices flooded the market in the years that followed, the entire computing industry had to answer a new question. Not how fast can this run, but how long will the battery last? Efficiency stopped being a secondary concern. It became the primary survival condition. ARM did not need to adapt to this new reality. It had been designed for exactly this moment. While by '86 engineers scrambled to build low-power variants of their architecture, ARM chips were already running cool, sipping energy and scaling across billions of devices. By the early 2010s, ARM had become the most widely deployed computing architecture in human history. More ARM chips had been produced than any other processor design ever. The mobile era did not just give ARM a market. It gave ARM legitimacy. It proved that the philosophy of restraint could survive at scale, and that simplicity, when executed with discipline, was not a weakness. It was a competitive weapon. But the moment that truly shook the industry, the moment that forced even the most stubborn x86 defenders to sit up and pay attention, came in November of 2020. That was when Apple released its first Mac computers powered by the M1 chip, an ARM-based processor designed entirely in-house. The results were not subtle. The M1 MacBook Air ran cooler than Intel-based laptops, with no fan required. Battery life nearly doubled. Performance benchmarks exceeded machines that cost significantly more. And it did all of this while running a chip that consumed a fraction of the power of comparable x86 designs. The technology press called it a paradigm shift, but it was more than that. It was a public demonstration, conducted on one of the most watched product stages in the world, that the assumptions everyone had made about x86's dominance were simply wrong. Apple had not just switched architectures. Apple had exposed the gap between what by '86 had promised and what ARM could now deliver. The message was clear, even if nobody said it aloud. The old world was ending. The only question was how quickly. While consumers watched Apple's reveal with fascination, something equally dramatic was happening behind closed doors in the world's largest data centers. Amazon Web Services launched its Graviton processor in 2018, an ARM-based chip designed specifically for cloud computing workloads. Microsoft and Google followed with their own ARM-based server initiatives. The motivation was not ideological. It was financial. In a data center running hundreds of thousands of servers, efficiency is not a preference. It is an economic imperative. Even a small reduction in power consumption per chip, multiplied across an entire cloud infrastructure, translates to hundreds of millions of dollars saved annually. Amazon reported that its Graviton chips offered up to 40% better price performance than comparable x86 instances. At cloud scale, that number is not a statistic. It is a business model. The cloud did not choose ARM because it was fashionable. The cloud chose ARM because it was cheaper to run, and in the infrastructure business, cost per watt is the only argument that ever truly wins. Hardware, however, is only half the battle. The other half, the harder half, is software. x86's deepest moat was never its chips. It was its ecosystem. Decades of applications, games, enterprise tools, drivers, compilers, and developer workflows had all been built with x86 assumptions baked in. Moving to a new architecture meant recompiling, retesting, rebuilding, and in some cases rewriting enormous amounts of code. For many organizations, that was simply not a feasible investment. ARM thrived in environments where one company controlled the full stack. Apple could force the transition because Apple controlled the hardware, the operating system, and the developer tools simultaneously. They could manage the translation layer called Rosetta 2 that allowed old x86 applications to run on M-series chips without modification. But in the fragmented world of enterprise computing, where dozens of vendors and thousands of legacy systems interact in unpredictable ways, that kind of coordinated transition was far more difficult. This is why the war was never really about which architecture was faster. It was about who could move developers, who could lower the friction of migration, and who could make the ecosystem cost of switching feel smaller than the ecosystem cost of staying. And then, quietly, from the world of academic research, a third competitor entered the field. RISC-V, pronounced RISC-V, was born at the University of California, Berkeley, in 2010. Unlike x86 or ARM, RISC-V is an open standard. No corporation owns it. No license fee is required to implement it. No gatekeeper controls who can build a RISC-V chip or how. The implications of that freedom are profound. Any company, any government, any research institution can design a RISC-V processor without asking permission or paying royalties. It is, in essence, the open-source movement applied to processor architecture. And in a world where technology independence has become a matter of national security, that openness is not just an academic virtue. It is a strategic asset. RISC-V is not the fastest architecture. It is not the most mature. But it offers something that neither x86 nor ARM can match: the freedom to build without dependence. And in the current global climate, that freedom has become extraordinarily valuable. To understand why, you have to understand what happened when geopolitics entered the chip industry. In 2018, the United States government began restricting American technology exports to certain Chinese companies, most notably Huawei. Those restrictions ultimately blocked Huawei's access to ARM architecture licenses, because ARM Holdings, while originally British, operates under American jurisdiction after its acquisition by SoftBank and its subsequent licensing agreements. The effect was immediate and clarifying. China's technology industry suddenly understood that its dependence on foreign-controlled architectures was not just an economic concern. It was a national vulnerability. The Chinese government dramatically accelerated its investment in domestic chip development, and RISC-V became a central part of that strategy. India and Europe launched their own initiatives. Suddenly, nations were choosing chip architectures not because of benchmark scores, but because of who controlled the design. Dependence, once invisible, had become a liability that no government was willing to ignore. The chip had become a geopolitical instrument. But even as the architecture war intensified, the nature of computing itself was shifting beneath everyone's feet. For most of computing history, the processor was the center of everything. The CPU was where the important work happened, and everything else, memory, storage, graphics, existed to serve it. That model no longer holds. Modern chips are ecosystems in themselves. Apple's M-series processors contain not just CPU cores, but dedicated graphics processors, neural engine units for machine learning, image signal processors, secure enclaves for encryption, and unified memory architectures that allow all of these components to share data at speeds no discrete chip arrangement could match. Qualcomm, Samsung, and Nvidia have followed similar paths. The GPU, once a specialist component for rendering games, has become arguably more important than the CPU for tasks involving artificial intelligence and parallel computation. The CPU has not disappeared, but it has been demoted. In the modern chip, the processor is the conductor of an orchestra, not the soloist. What matters now is not which instruction set the CPU uses, but how elegantly all the components work together. And so we arrive at the present, a moment with no single winner and no clear resolution. x86 endures. Intel and AMD continue to dominate in areas where legacy software, raw computational power, and established enterprise infrastructure make switching impractical or impossible. ARM has become the architecture of efficiency and integration. It dominates mobile, has made serious inroads into laptops and desktops through Apple's transition, and is growing steadily in the cloud. Where companies control their own ecosystems, ARM wins. Where ecosystems are fragmented, the battle continues. RISC-V grows not by outperforming its rivals, but by serving the places where independence matters more than polish. In embedded systems, in government-sponsored research programs, in nations seeking technological sovereignty, RISC-V is accumulating momentum that the established players cannot stop because they cannot buy it or license it away. The future is not unified. It is hybrid, fragmented, and increasingly specialized. But beneath all of this, beneath the architecture debates and the benchmark comparisons and the geopolitical maneuvering, there is a deeper truth that rarely gets discussed. Design without fabrication is fiction. The companies that can actually manufacture advanced chips, primarily TSMC in Taiwan and Samsung in South Korea, hold more power than any architecture owner. An ARM design that cannot be manufactured is worthless. An x86 roadmap that depends on a single foundry in a geopolitically sensitive region is a strategic fragility. The United States recognized this when it passed the CHIPS and Science Act in 2022, committing over $52 billion to rebuild domestic semiconductor manufacturing capacity. The real war is not between instruction sets. It is between nations competing for control of the physical infrastructure that turns architectural philosophy into working silicon. Whoever controls the foundries controls the future. Everything else is software. Step back from the technical details for a moment, and you can see the shape of a much larger story. This is a story about how nothing that appears permanent ever truly is. x86 looked eternal for 4 decades, and then, within a single product generation, Apple proved that the assumptions were wrong. ARM looked like a mobile curiosity and became the most deployed architecture in history. RISC-V looked like an academic project and became a tool of national sovereignty. The lesson is uncomfortable but important. The thing you depend on most, the infrastructure of your profession, your industry, your daily life, may not be as stable as it feels. Inertia creates the illusion of permanence. But underneath that stillness, new philosophies are always developing, always waiting for the moment when the balance of advantage shifts. In your own life, the parallel is worth sitting with. The skills, the systems, the habits you have built your security around, are they genuinely strong? Or are they simply expensive to replace? There is a difference between being indispensable and being embedded. One is earned. The other is just friction. The wisest response to this uncertainty is not anxiety. It is adaptability. It is the willingness to question your own foundations before the market or history or circumstances question them for you. It is the discipline to stay curious about what is developing at the margins, in the quiet spaces where the next paradigm is assembling itself before anyone has named it. The architecture war has no final chapter. It is ongoing, reshaping, and accelerating. And its outcome will determine, more than most people realize, how artificial intelligence develops, how nations project power, how companies compete, and how ordinary people experience computing in the decades ahead. So here's the question to carry with you after this story ends. What in your own world looks permanent today, but might look obsolete in 10 years? And what would it take for you to see that before it happens, rather than after? Think carefully about that. The answer might surprise you. Thank you for spending this time with this story. If it made you think differently about the world around you, that is exactly what this channel exists for. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one.